my name is Kathy Yera. Today I'll be presenting chapters 1 through 10 of the basic learning process. And here is my UCF ID. That's me. Okay, so in chapter 1 we learned about change, the consistency of change. And during this chapter we can see how they go on to speak about climate change, population, the increase of population and the effects that can have, striking new diseases. So I found this topic very interesting just because a lot of that chapter does relate to things that are going on in our current world. Like, for instance, new diseases arising. At the moment we have the coronavirus, which is a pandemic that no one really saw coming. At least I would say I definitely didn't see coming. So it's very interesting to be able to read that chapter and see how change is constantly happening, and that has to do with, like, for instance, the coronavirus. Another topic that I found interesting on that chapter was how it said that the world is over, we're always growing, so we're evolving and things like that. But one of the striking concept was that we become overpopulated in a sense that we may not have all the resources at some point just because of all the constant change, or we have to learn to adapt in different ways. So for instance, some of the resources that we could be missing out on if we continue to expand could be food, housing, water, things like that. So it is definitely important to limit what we use, as well as climate change. Climate change is a major factor happening in our world right now, that if it's something we can control, we should, and it's also something that is just consistently changing. In chapter 2, we learned about study of learning and behavior. So basically, throughout this chapter, we learned how we can learn through making mistakes or errors. One of these was, as an example of a person like counting a register to me. I've worked in retail for a long time, so I found this very easy to remember, that you can learn through error and you can become faster in a sense. So for instance, a person counting a register at the very beginning may be a little slow. They may need more time to make sure everything is correct, but as time goes on, they start learning more and more, and they're able to count their register a lot faster at the end of their shift. So all in all, we learn how there are ways we can measure learning, and throughout that time we can interfere some errors, and we just have to learn how to overcome it with practice. So in chapter 3, we learned about Pavlov's conditioning theory. Throughout this, we saw how Pavlov gave meat powder to the dog, which caused him to salivate. In this theory, or in this experiment, the meat powder was the unconditioned stimulus, as the salivating of the dog was the unconditioned response. We later on saw as well that he gave the dog a food dish, which also caused the dog to salivate. But in this reference, it was a conditioned stimulus and a conditioned response versus an unconditioned response and stimulus. So moving forward, in chapter 4, we learned a little bit about prejudice. During this chapter, I found it very interesting just because it also, like chapter 1, relates to a topic that is currently happening. A lot of people have prejudice towards certain types of religion, race, ethnicity, color of skin. It could be honestly anything. Striking quote that I found in the book was, "We seem to learn to dislike people and things in much the same way that we learn to fear them." So in my interpretation, I learned that I kind of referred this to everything happening currently with George Floyd. It's unfortunate everything that's happening with that. Although I found this quote interesting just because the cop may have been fearing for his life, but it necessarily doesn't mean that he handled it the right way. In the sense that he did take a life, and that this was something that could have been, that didn't have to happen if that fear wasn't there. Chapter 5, we learned about operant conditioning, and we saw how Skinner ran his experiments and how he managed to have positive and negative reinforcers. This had to do with strengthening behaviors due to its consequences. We also learned about reward learning, which is also a positive reinforcer during this chapter. Alright, so I really like this chapter. In chapter 6, we talked about shaping. We saw how Skinner did shaping on his daughter with the lights. What I found the most interesting about this was that it can also be done on animals. So I think that a good example for shaping would be like teaching your dog not to pee on the carpet. So you would basically create new actions, new behaviors to get them from stopping that urinating on the carpet. Another example of shaping is that it is really good to stop actions that are unwanted or unneeded. So it's a good way to teach animals or humans how to interact better. Alright, so in chapter 7, we learned about different types of schedules that we can see. One of them was a multiple schedule. So in the multiple schedule, this can be obviously many schedules put together in one to be called a multiple schedule. Another one we learned about was a chain schedule. A chain schedule can be as well as various schedules. This schedule will only be considered a chain schedule if it has been completed. Moving forward, we learned about mixed schedules. In mixed schedules, they're basically schedules put together but that include no stimuli. Lastly, we learned about concurrent schedules. Concurrent schedules are two schedules that can be available at once. In chapter 8, we learned about punishment. Punishment is something that we can do to reduce an unwanted action. Throughout the text, we were able to see two types of punishment, one which included a positive and one which was a negative punishment. A positive punishment, as stated from the book, is the consequence of a behavior is the appearance of an increase in the intensity of a stimuli. An example of a positive punishment would be a kid touching a stove and the kid gets his hand burned because the stove was hot, so he's less likely to come back and touch the stove again. Now, a negative punishment, as stated in our book, is a behavior is weakened by the removal of or a decrease in the intensity of a stimuli. An example of a negative punishment would be a person parking at a parking lot where you can only park from 11 a.m. to 7 and he parks at 3 p.m. Obviously, he's going to receive a ticket, so the cop gives him a ticket, and that would be considered a negative punishment. So in chapter 9, we learned about operant learning. This is a form of teaching, and not only humans learning, but animals learning as well. I found it very interesting in the topic where we speak about the zoo, how they were able to train and treat aggressive animals or large animals, like the aggressive large elephant that we heard about or we read about in the textbook. They're able to trim his calluses basically by performing operant learning on him. So he knows that although he might not like this, getting his calluses trimmed, he is not allowed to hurt the person or the individual doing this to him. I found this very interesting because you can use operant learning as well in a work environment, which can improve the performance of that employee or employer, and it can create positive work habits. Lastly, chapter 10. Throughout this chapter, we learned about just a lot of observational learning. So one of the very interesting but almost common sense things that I really liked reading about was the imitating process. So humans will imitate other humans as dogs and cats will imitate their same species. So I found that very interesting because it's also a good way of learning. You learn, for instance, as an individual, you can learn positive habits and traits from a leadership role, like a manager. So you learn and you obtain these acts and habits that they have, and it helps you grow as an employer in that sense, or an employee. All right, so that is it for my presentation. Thank you so much for watching. I hope to receive some feedback from you. Thank you.